I have the
All
jitters.
right. All right, everyone. So thanks to those that have been hanging around all morning and taking advantage of our live sessions. And for the next 30 minutes and taking us into the lunch hour, I've got Gilbert Marquez from Nardone Brothers Baking. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with their pizzas. And I will let Gilbert take it away. And thank you again for being here and being one of our gold sponsors. We greatly appreciate that. So I'll give you the spotlight.
Well, good afternoon. Well, it's still morning technically, right? We still have half an hour before the noon time. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for attending our session. We really appreciate that. In this session this morning, we're not going to spend a lot of time on product, or actually any time on product, other than to ask that in the future, later on this afternoon, tomorrow, and Thursday, please visit our booth, booth number 102, Nardone Brothers Pizza. With regards to introductions, my name is Gilbert Marquez. I'm the Regional Sales Director for Nardone Brothers Pizza, and I take care of the state of Texas, along with our broker, McLean Marketing, and I know that a lot of them are on watching as well, so hello to all you all. We appreciate your time. During this session, as I mentioned, we're not going to talk about product. We want to present something of value that you all can use to help your teams grow and help your teams be strong teams. So in this session, we're going to talk about conflict. We know that conflict is inevitable. It happens. It's just going to happen within our work groups, within our families, within any situation we find ourselves in. Conflict is inevitable. But can it be managed and reduced? Well, yes, it can. That's what we plan to demonstrate today. Now, just a little heads up, this session that we put on is normally an hour-long session, and it's very interactive. We have the audience commenting, and we have questions and things like that out there. So we have a reduced amount of time, and we don't have the ability to interact, which I'm very sad about, but that's okay. So unfortunately for you, you're gonna have to listen to me talk for half an hour. But as we ask questions and think about things, they're gonna be rhetorical questions. Please just think about the questions we're asking and how you would respond if we were in a live session or face-to-face session where you're able to comment. We know that there's a lot of wisdom and experience. Many of you are leaders in your groups, whether you're managers, directors, supervisors, and you have to take the lead in your groups. And so you all have a lot of experience. As we talk about this topic of conflict, we're not going to give you any new revelations on how to deal with it. Basically, because you are already successful leaders in your groups, you already know all the things that we're about to talk about. We're just going to put it into an organized manner so that we can have it clearly in our minds, so that when we do face conflict in our work groups, we can face it more successfully. So here's a rhetorical question for you all to think about. How many out there in the cyber world today enjoy conflict? How many of you like a good fight? Well, if we're able to see a show of hands, we would probably not see very many hands, because most people don't like conflict. In fact, many people will tell you, I hate confrontation. So it's evident that many people, almost everybody, desires a peaceful workplace. And most are trying to have good relations with their coworkers, with their bosses, with their families. And as leaders, managers, supervisors, directors, we want our work groups to be free of conflict, don't we? We've all had to deal with employees or coworkers who just desire to incite conflict. Some people just do want to have that argument. That man was willing to pay for an argument. And isn't it true that when our work groups have unmanaged conflict, then we all pay, not with outright cash, but we pay with things like reduced productivity, lowered morale, high turnover, and in general, just a stressed out work group, don't we? Now, as I mentioned earlier, most people are not like that man. They don't want arguments. They're not willing to pay for an argument. That man was seeking conflict, but we want to avoid conflict as much as we can. So these are some of the things that we're going to share in this session. So let me just pull up my PowerPoint here and get it going. Thank you for your patience as I deal with this technology here. So the things that we're going to learn in this session: how can we create a workplace culture that is conducive to trust, unity, and mutual understanding? We'll endeavor to identify attributes of a unified workplace, number one. Secondly, as leaders in our work groups, how can we set the example for our work groups in mutually beneficial conflict resolution? Here we're going to describe how an effective leader can take the lead in maintaining a unified workplace. And then finally, as we mentioned, conflicts are inevitable. They will happen no matter how hard we work. So when conflicts do arise, how can we effectively serve as neutral mediators for our fellow workers? So this will outline the steps for an effective mediation. So let's get into our first point here. How can we create a workplace culture that's conducive to trust, unity, and mutual understanding? Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of experience on this virtual program today. Many of you have served as leaders for a long time and effectively, because obviously you've been promoted, you've successfully served in your jobs for a long time as leaders. So you have a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to give you any new revelations, but hopefully we can organize it in a way that will allow you to think deeply about how you can create that culture of unity in your workplace. I'm sure there's some of you have served for 5, 10, 20, 30 years as leaders in your work groups. So as you think about this question, how many of you, and again, we can't really have a show of hands, but think of it mentally with a show of hands. If I were to ask the group, how many of you have been in a work group that is not trusting or unified or empathetic? Well, again, if we could see hands, we'd probably see a lot of hands. That's something we've all experienced, sad to say. So when you think about that time when you were in that work group, what are some of the attributes that a difficult workplace displays? What are some of the things that come to mind? Now, we've given this presentation several times around the country, and again, it was in a live setting, a face-to-face setting, and many of the folks with experiences such as yours have shared with us some of the things that they've seen. So let me share some of that experience with you. Here's what we've come up with when we see a workplace is just not enjoyable to be in. We see distrust, we see a lack of communication, we see jealousy, feelings of scarcity, there's just not enough rope to go around, public non-constructive criticism, selfishness, cliques is a big one that we've often heard of. If I ask that question, we'd hear that. And then the next thing is gossip. We see that. And those work groups that are just tough to be in, and office politics and a fear of mistakes. All of these things make our work group a difficult place to work in it if we have those attributes. If we worked in a workplace that had all of these things, how do you feel on Monday morning? You don't feel like getting up to go to work, do you? So how can we avoid these things? What do we want our workplace to look? We know we don't want it to look like this, right? We want it to look like a peaceful workplace, right? Have you ever heard someone say, my workplace or my work team is like a family? We've heard that. And again, if I asked for a show of hands, many of you would raise your hand and say, yeah, I've been in a work group where it felt like a family. Well, what brings that on? What makes a work group feel like a family? Well, what are some of the strong attributes of a family? Well, again, we've asked this question many times as we've made this presentation, and we've come up with a list of things that that really make a work group feel close and united. And so here's some of the things we've come up with. No doubt you have some others that are just as important. But some of the things we've identified is trust, honesty, open communication, mutual support, everyone rooting for each other, not just the individual, but rooting for each other. A feeling of abundance. What do I mean by that? Well, when there's a feeling of abundance, everybody in the work group feels like they have an opportunity to advance. They have an opportunity to receive a recognition from their managers and their superiors. Private positive feedback. In the other list, the bad list, we talked about public criticism, but private positive feedback can really help someone to work. And then here's another positive thing, public commendation. If someone does a great job and you recognize them in front of all their peers, how do they feel? Not only do they feel happy, it really motivates them to even work harder, doesn't it? And they're going to continue to do their best so they can receive that commendation as well. Mentorship is another thing we've often heard leaders talk about when they describe a really unified work group. Everyone's willing to support one another and share their expertise with each other. You may have employees that are on the same level as far as pay, as far as their role in the group, but they all have different skills that contribute to the whole, don't they? And so when they're willing to share that with each other, mentorship happens, and it's really good. And then continuous learning happens. So those are all things that are attributes of a peaceful workplace. So the first two on there, though, are super important, especially when it comes to managing conflict: trust and honesty. If there's no honesty, well, then you can't have trust in your work group, can you? You can only have conflict if there's no honesty, right? Because that conflict or dishonesty leads to conflict. So it's important that our folks, are the folks that we're leading, feel comfortable to be honest with us, and we're ready to be honest with them. And that builds that trust, and that takes open communication. So all of those are things that we want to see in a peaceful workplace. So here's a contrast, right? We don't want to see the things in our work group on the left. We do want to see the things that are on the right. So we've accomplished our first goal, haven't we? Our first goal is to be able to identify a work group that is unified. So now let's go on to our second objective. As leaders, how can we set the example for our work group in mutually beneficial conflict resolution? Well, I wish I could see your hands, but I can't, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. How many of you here have raised children or are currently raising children? No doubt there's a lot of parents probably in the audience today. We would see a lot of hands. So let me ask you all parents, you who have raised children or are raising, oh, and I see some electronic raised hands. Thank you for that. That's a little bit of a feedback. I appreciate that. So a lot of parents out there, let me ask you this, does this work? The model of do as I say, not as I do. Does that work when we're raising our kids? No, of course it doesn't. Why not? Because if we're telling them one thing, but we're doing another thing, then our kids just aren't going to listen. And the same is true of our work group. When we lead our work group or our organization, we can wag our tongues and lay down as many rules as we want, but until the people that we're leading see us living by the principles that we lay down, they're not going to follow. So we as leaders in our groups must set an example. If you were to visit a work group as an outsider, say, and you notice that there's a lot of gossip, a lot of jealousy, distrust, and conflict, what would you conclude? Well, you most likely would conclude that the leadership of that group at least tolerates and probably is an active participant in those kinds of things. However, on the other hand, if you visited a work group that really has that familial feel that we talked about earlier, what would you conclude? Well, you would conclude that the leaders are setting the example. So there's just no way around it. We want our folks to be unified. We have to set the example. So let's talk about 12 ways that we can set the example. Actually, 11 ways, I'm sorry. 11 ways. Whenever there's a conflict in our group, we have to address it immediately. If we don't, what happens? Then something that started out small could blow up and become something really big. Oh, I'm just getting a notice, a technical notice, to move this up.
What's going on, Gilbert? We can still see your screen just fine.
Oh, okay. There was a note. Someone popped a note up that said, move this out of the way, and I was trying to do it, but it doesn't let me. So, okay.
And I'm viewing as attendee and as moderator, so I'm seeing everything perfectly. You're fine.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. I appreciate that. So what was I talking about? Okay, addressing conflict immediately. See, when I got that notice, I addressed it right away. I wanted to take care of it, and Carrie and I worked it out. But anyway, so what I'm saying was addressing conflicts immediately helps you to resolve things that are small before they get big, right? What about the next thing? Let's go back to the screen here. Check your attitude. As a leader, what's your attitude when you go in to help resolve a conflict? Are you maybe partial to one side or another, or are you neutral? That's a very important thing. This next one is very important. Have the courage to listen. If we truly listen to what's going on, we can help come up with solutions that are going to resolve the conflict. And I'm sorry that my timing, We have to rush through a little bit because I spent way too much time in the beginning, so I apologize. The next thing we want to talk about is don't forget about the other person and their feelings. We talked about how important it is to listen. When we're attempting to resolve a conflict, we often think about, well, this is how I feel about the situation, or this is how that situation is affecting me. But don't forget, it's also affecting the other person. And so if we realize that, we'll work towards a solution that will be mutually beneficial, won't it? We always want to remember that, and it's a really good quote here by Maya Angelou. People forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. So we want to keep that in mind when we're dealing with conflicts. We also want to make sure that we're trusting of others and keep an open mind. If our mind is closed, this can just prolong a conflict. Again, if it's a small conflict, it can turn very big because our mind may be closed. So as a leader, we want to be open to discuss ideas and learn to trust others. Also, we want to leave our emotions at the door. Sometimes when there's a conflict, oh man, it really just gets to us, doesn't it? And we get emotional about it. Now, nobody's going to be without emotion, but can we recognize how this emotion is affecting us, set it aside, and focus on resolving the issue? Now, here's another very big one. Apologize, even if you did nothing wrong. This is difficult, especially if we're not as humble as we really should be, right? When there's a conflict and that we're involved in, the last thing we want to do is apologize. We want to prove that the other person's wrong and that I'm right. But we got to set that mentality aside if we really want to solve the problem. Have you ever heard the saying, no matter how thin you slice the bologna, there's still two sides? So in any conflict, there's two sides. Even if it's 99% his fault and 1% your fault, apologize for the 1% that's your fault. And it's never going to be 100 and 0. So just apologize for even that 1%, and that will start the process of resolving that conflict. It's not easy, it takes humility, but it's an important step. Genuinely care about other people. This is also very important. When you care about the other person, even though you're having a conflict with them, you can more easily resolve a conflict. One way to do that is, we all know that there's just certain personalities, certain things that rub us the wrong way. And if you have that person in your work group, recognize, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, don't forget about the other person. Recognize that they're a person too. And before the conflict starts, because you know it probably will, you just know that kind of person that rubs you the wrong way, think about that person in a kind way. Try to find even the smallest amount of good, and then take a magnifying glass and look at that small amount of goodness in that person. And then it'll grow, really, it'll grow in your mind. And then when the conflict comes up, you can view that, you can look at that person and say, okay, here's the good thing about them, let's resolve this conflict. Let conflict inspire creativity. Now, we talked about how we're trying to reduce conflict as much as we can, but it is inevitable. So when it does happen, let it inspire creativity. Try to get your team to think of ideas of how we can avoid this conflict in the future and how we can creatively resolve it right now. Don't try to win, right? We don't want to try to win. If we do, then nobody's going to win. If everybody's trying to win this argument, nobody's going to win. Conflict is not a competition, so don't treat it like one. We want to recognize that the goal is peace in our workplace. So if there's a winner, then there's a loser. Right? We don't want that. We want two winners, right? So that's how we have to view our conflicts. The final one is a very important one, especially for leaders. Be flexible and be willing to change. This is so important because as leaders, we may get the impression, well, I'm not in the wrong, they're in the wrong. But if we're humble and we really recognize there may be something that I'm doing that's contributing to this conflict. So I need to be flexible and willing to change. Look at myself through a humble lens. So those are, and I'm sorry I had to go through them so quickly. Again, if we were in this, in a discussion-wise, we'd be talking back and forth, and this part is really the main part of the presentation. But we're running a little low on time, so let's move on to our third objective. When conflicts do arise, how can we effectively serve as mediators for our fellow workers? Well, first we want to recognize that there's a variety of conflicts. Not all conflicts are the same. If we had more time, we'd talk about these different kinds of conflicts, but these are just the basic ones. There's leadership conflicts, interdependency-based conflicts, work style differences, culturally based dissension, and personality clashes. These are some of the things that lead to conflicts in our work groups. And of course, there's others, but these are some of the main ones. So as a leader, let's imagine that we have two of our employees who are having a conflict, and you're not involved, but you do see that it needs to be dealt with. So what can you do to do that? Well, there's 6 steps to conflict mediation, and we'll briefly touch on those. The first one is you get the two folks or the two groups that are having the conflict, and you set them in basically a neutral setting. That's where the introductory remarks happen. You state the ground rules. You're the mediator. You as a neutral leader is the mediator, and you make sure that they're both comfortable with that, knowing that you are not partial on either side. And then you set those ground rules. You help them to know that each person is going to get their turn to talk, but with no interrupting. So once you've had those introductory remarks, you've set the ground rules, then the next step is the statement of the problem by the parties. So after that opening statement by the mediator, each of the sides will have an opportunity to tell their story, and it's very important, uninterrupted. Most often, the person who's requested the mediation will go first. Now, this is not just a statement of facts, but it's an opportunity for each side to frame the issue in their own minds, so they can really know what do I see as the problem, and what does this person see as the problem. And then you as the mediator can get a really good sense of where the root is. The third step is information gathering. So now you as a mediator are going to ask open-ended questions to each of the parties to get the emotional undercurrent, to understand, again, where feelings are going, why things ended up this way. As you're doing this, you're going to want to summarize often and make sure that you have agreement on both sides as to what is being said. Because we know sometimes when there's an argument, things are said that are misunderstood, and other things are said that are misunderstood by the other party. But as a mediator, you're not going to let that happen. You're going to clearly communicate with the folks as you're gathering that information. The fourth step is identification of the problem. Each party has had the opportunity to speak uninterrupted and state what they view as the problem. And now you're going to negotiate basically with both sides to come to an agreement on what the problem really is. Okay, so now that's the fourth step. The fifth step is bargaining and generating options. Once you've been able to do that, once you've been able to truly identify the problem, then you can start looking for solutions. If you have agreement on both sides what the problem is, you start looking for options. You ask one party, how can we settle this? And you ask the other party, how can we settle this? And then you're looking for compromise that will allow for a win-win situation. And hopefully that will lead to the sixth step, which is reaching an agreement. So I have a lot more information. I know we've kind of really touched on it briefly. If you want to reach out to me, you'll have my email in the HOVA app. I'd be happy to send you more details on each of these steps, as well as this whole PowerPoint presentation. But if you reach an agreement, then what happens? Then the sides are happy, and you have a work group that looks like this one. See these guys? Those are actually the Nardone brothers. And as a family, they probably have issues that they had to work through, but they worked through them, and now they're happy. And now what are they going to do? They're going to enjoy a pizza. And it really isn't eating a universal sign of peace. And so that's what we want. We want peace in our work groups. And I think I've gone right up to my limit. So I really appreciate all of your attention to this today. I'd love to discuss this. This is a topic that I really enjoy talking about. So if anybody wants to reach out to me and talk more about it, I'd be happy to do that on a one-on-one basis. And again, we look forward to seeing you at our booth 102. We're gonna have our booth fully manned for all 3 days. So we look forward to seeing some of you there. And thank you again for your attention.
Hi, okay. Gilbert, are you still there? Okay, good. I lost the screen for a minute. Thank you so much for that was such good reminders for all of us, because that is not only work related, reminding, how we treat each other and how we approach conflicts, but also in our personal life, family members, friends. And I love the fact that you took your gold star presentation out of the product box, so to speak, and gave us something really wonderful. So thank you again for
Thank you.
being a sponsor and providing us with a really cool presentation. So
Thanks for the platform. You all have a good day.
all right, thanks. All right.